Hey, all you cool cats and kittens. That's a Carol Baskin reference for those of you who enjoy the Tiger King. Well, welcome back to to our videos about political science 3710, philosophy 4360, and 5400 at St. Louis University. And so we're continuing our trek through the medieval period and its political thought. This is a really fun week of readings for me, and I hope y'all enjoyed it as well. John of Paris, Giles of Rome, and Marsilius of Padua. What's exciting for me about them is that we have done readings in the past that set out some important principles for how Christians ought to behave in political life, and also how, more broadly, institutions like church and state, temporal and spiritual authority ought to be coordinated and ought to behave toward one another. And two of the thinkers that probably have been most influential for us has been Pope Gelasius and St. Augustine. So St. Augustine on the two cities and Pope Gelasius on this notion of the two powers, that they are differentiated and also ordered, such as the spiritual power is superior to the temporal power. Well, the readings this week really, I think, begin to put some flesh on those skeletons and present different ideas for how those theories could be incarnated in everyday life. Uh, what's noticeable also is that the readings we did last week, for instance, concern Christianity more or less in this at the time and then subsequent those next few centuries after the accession of Constantine and his edicts promoting Christianity throughout the Roman Empire. We're now looking at thinkers in the 13th and 14th centuries, for whom Christian Europe is deeply Christian, and the relationship between empire and papacy is operative and conditions a great deal of political life. One note is you might have noticed that historically we skipped a pretty major thinker, Thomas Aquinas. So we jumped ahead. This week we're reading thinkers who mostly come in the generation after Thomas Aquinas. And then next week we'll start, or actually our next set of readings, which is not for next week, we'll backtrack a bit to begin to look at Thomas Aquinas. And I think it'd be really interesting to see how y'all think Thomas Aquinas fits amongst these three thinkers, and how these three thinkers fit vis-a-vis St. Augustine and Pope Gelasius. So I hope you begin to see some patterns, some similarities, but also some real differences. And so, as the O'Donovan marks well for y'all, and also McCoy, what's at stake here to some extent is the conflicts between the temporal authorities, especially the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France, with the Church and particularly the papacy. And just a small historical note, as you probably know, France is one of the, if not the earliest examples of the nation state in European history. So, in the time period that we're reading about right now, the 13th and 14th centuries, the French monarchs have worked hard for some centuries to consolidate their royal power in France. And of course, that, as you know, is a struggle that's really only completed with Louis XIV, not that long before the French Revolution when it all falls apart. But the French kingdom is an example of the kind of nation state that wants to have supremacy within its own borders, wants to have a monopoly on violence, as Max Weber would say. And so while the relationship between the Holy Roman Empire and the papacy had frequently been tense in medieval Europe, the relationship between the papacy and these nascent nation states is going to be still tenser, because these nation states, beginning with France, are going to be making claims of a nature against a religious spiritual authority that the Holy Roman Empire would never have dreamed of making. So I'm going to talk a bit about each of our three readings of John of Paris, Giles of Rome, and Marsilius of Padua, and talk briefly about some of their major arguments. John of Paris is a fascinating reading, I think, because he wants to work hard as you read to separate the political sphere from the religious sphere. So for modern thinkers, people living in modernity like ourselves, a lot of what he says might seem kind of obvious. But John of Paris is advancing some really interesting and perhaps novel Aristotelian arguments for his time period. He's trying to do so with somewhat Augustinian language. So, for instance, in chapter 18, when he wants to argue that there is a kind of justice possible within earthly kingdoms, within political realms, without being subjected to the kingdom of Christ or the kingdom of God, he wants to take Augustine's cities of God and kind of retrofit them into his more Aristotelian framework. Because Augustine, in the City of God, of course, argues that there are two basic cities, the city of God and the city of man, and each city is oriented by a love, right? That the city of God is oriented by a love of God to the contempt of self, and the city of man is oriented by a love of self to the contempt of God and to the contempt of neighbor. And John of Paris doesn't exactly disagree with that, but he seems to think that humans are capable of much more robust virtues than Augustine would allow for. Because in the City of God, Augustine says, no city oriented toward the love of self can be just. He says basically there has been no res publica, republic, or public thing, common enterprise, if you like, no city oriented towards justice because it's always oriented toward a love of self. And so this is really the heart of what John of Paris is getting to at chapter 18. In chapter 18 from our reading, he asks, if the kingdom of Christ must rule over the earthly city for perfect justice. Part of why this matters is because the kingdom of Christ, of course, is an anticipation. The kingdom of Christ, he means the city of God, and he sees the church as a kind of prefiguring of that kingdom. He sees the church as a kind of cipher for for the heavenly city, the kingdom of Christ. So the question is, does the church need to rule over politics directly to bring about perfect justice in the earthly kingdom? And John of Paris says no. And John of Paris goes on to make an argument that goes well beyond our readings for today, but basically says that the church has no power. Yes, it has a very lofty end in bringing human beings toward celestial life with God, toward the beatific vision, but that doesn't give the church any kind of power. What it gives it is a kind of dignity. So what's fascinating with John of Paris is you begin to see the ways in which the invisible two cities of Augustine become visible, and there's a way in which the earthly city and the earthly political power and the church can participate pretty directly in the city of God. It's also interesting to note that John of Paris seems to agree with one side of Gelasius's argument more than the other. So Gelasius essentially has been canonically interpreted to advance two claims, and we talked about them last week. The first claim is this differentiation, this distinction. There are two powers, the temporal and spiritual. And the second thesis is that the spiritual power has a primacy over that temporal power. Well, if you think about John of Paris's relationship to those two theses, it seems as though he's much more concerned to push for Gelasius's differentiation or distinction between the two authorities than for that primacy of the spiritual. John of Paris wants to emphasize the ways in which temporal and spiritual authority are distinct, not very worried about that primacy of the spiritual. He reduces it to a kind of dignity, as you read. The church has a kind of dignity, but no power. I'm just keeping track of the time to make sure I don't go terribly over, but as you know, that's going to happen anyway. Our second reading, Giles of Rome, he moves in quite the opposite direction. And if you looked at this reading and others, you'll probably notice that Giles of Rome goes by several names, Giles being an English translation of the Latin Aegidius, which sometimes gets turned into the Italian Egidio. And then sometimes he's called Romanus as his last name, meaning from Rome, but his family was probably the Colonna family, so sometimes he gets called Colonna instead of Romanus. So, fun historical note there. But to put it simply, Giles of Rome is a much more, his thought seems to be more complex than John of Paris, and I know some students have some difficulties understanding him, which is completely fine, of course. Um, but Giles' interest, when you compare him to Gelasius, it's much more about the primacy of the spiritual than the differentiation. In fact, we read throughout the text for this week that there's really a very simple unity perduring between the temporal and spiritual authority. The papacy is the direct source of all power for Giles, including all political or temporal power. He emphasizes repeatedly that all political power, it's only legitimate if it's instituted by the papacy, or if it's a political power that's assumed by some other political authority instituted by the papacy. Um, and so Giles presents a picture where, to assert that primacy of the spiritual over the temporal, he basically collapses the distinction in many ways between the temporal and the spiritual. He's not very worried about differentiating them. Or to put it another way, he does recognize their differentiation, but he basically sees the temporal authority politics as sort of the maintenance department of the church. That the church does its job, and the politics is just to make sure that the water is running and the electricity is on. So pretty basic things like that. And Giles of Rome is closely associated with what you might call theocracy or hierarchy in the radical Augustinian tradition of medieval Europe. Um, in some ways, Giles reminds us a lot more of Augustine than John of Paris would, but there are some pretty important differences between Giles and Augustine, and those are important differences partially because Giles is often taken to be one of the more important and certainly one of the better known students of St. Augustine in the medieval period. But note, while Augustine thinks that the two cities, so the earthly city and the city of God, are invisible and cut across church and state, cut across religious and political community, Giles seems to think that the two cities are quite visible. And in fact, he tends to identify them in pretty explicit ways with earthly institutions. So for him, the city of God seems to be just the church, whereas Augustine would have a far more ambiguous position on that. And so for Giles, the only way earthly political authority can be redeemed is as the direct servant of the church, of the city of God. But remember that for Augustine doesn't think that much political or earthly authority will support Christianity very directly, but he's sort of not worried about that, right? He seems to think that as long as there's a kind of very basic peace, we can all benefit from that. Everyone can benefit from it. So Giles is a pretty fascinating character. Our third thinker, Marsilius of Padua, Marsilius is a really fascinating thinker, and I hoped you enjoyed the somewhat longer dive into his thought. He is often taken to be a forerunner of republicanism or different notions of popular consent, and there's no question that Marsilius of Padua uh, seems to be more proto-modern to our eyes than John of Paris or Aquinas or Giles of Rome, whatever all those different words mean. But Marsilius of Padua is fascinating because he, as McCoy says, he basically takes the arguments of John of Paris and applies them further. And indeed, Marsilius comes quite close to saying what we read in Rousseau, some 4 centuries later, that Christianity has nothing to do with life on this side of heaven. So you might remember that we said that John of Paris does not deny the primacy of the spiritual power, but says that primacy is a matter of dignity, not of power. So Christianity, the church, has a kind of dignity, so a kind of symbolic superiority to temporal power, but that gives it no direct or indirect, for that matter, power over the state. Well, Marsilius pushes that a lot farther. Marsilius says if the church uh, has its dignity from a power coming in the next world, then that means that the church has no real power at all in this life, at least as far as this world is concerned. So he essentially says that the temporal or political power has supreme power in this life, leaving very little room for the church. Um, and so while John of Paris might be mistaken for a kind of separation of church and state argument, Marsilius thinks that the state has quite direct authority over the church because, again, the church has no power on this side of heaven, and the political power has all of it. It's interesting, too. This kind of notion of state power over religion is sometimes called a civil religion. So Marsilius is sometimes said to be a kind of prototype of civil religion, at least modern civil religion, because of course civil religion has been with us throughout human history. So that's really fascinating that John of Paris, you might think that his theory is leading to a total separation of church and state. And Marsilius' suggestion is, well, if you push that far enough, then what you end up with is the political control of religion. Uh, so Marsilius denies that there can be any sort of revealed origin of political rule, nothing like Giles of Rome. So where does political rule come from for Marsilius? Well, it's interesting. He really emphasizes the consent of the people. So Marsilius emphasizes that it's the consent of the people from which all power is derived, in whose name the political power rules. And this is fascinating because the consent of the people is an ancient argument for political legitimacy, and you can read it in Aristotle, you can read it in Aquinas, and many, many, many thinkers. But what makes Marsilius interesting for us is he seems to think that that consent of the people has a real significance apart from the natural and rational origins of political authority, and apart from the end of political authority in virtue. So Marsilius is going to is I don't want to be too anachronistic here, but you can see him as an early example of this emphasis on the consent of the people that, of course, in the 18th and 19th centuries becomes really quite prominent. And that consent of the people is distinguished, uh, is held to have great authority apart from any question about the natural origins of politics or its end, its purpose in excellence and virtue. Taking a step back again, it's fascinating to see how Gelasius really sets the tone for these three thinkers. Again, Pope Gelasius emphasizes in our readings both the differentiation of spiritual and temporal authority, so spiritual and temporal authority are distinct, and the primacy of the spiritual. What's fascinating about an awful lot of thinkers subsequent to Gelasius is the tendency of some to emphasize either that differentiation or emphasize that primacy and not the other thing. And so you get these very partial appropriations of Gelasius. John of Paris emphasizes very strongly the differentiation of spiritual and temporal authority. Giles of Rome underlines it's his whole thesis, the primacy of the spiritual, such that he tends to virtually obliterate the differentiation. Uh, Marsilius is the most interesting thinker of these three in terms of Gelasius, and it would be a really fun paper for somebody to write about the relationship between Marsilius and Gelasius. Um, but he pushes quite hard in the direction of denying the primacy of the spiritual. He comes quite close to denying the differentiation of the spiritual and the temporal, denying that again that Christianity has any real power or relevance this side of the world. You can also pair these three thinkers in terms of their relationship to St. Augustine. Again, in Augustine, there's a very subtle and nuanced account of the two cities. And again, what's so important about the two cities is they're fundamentally invisible, an invisible moral order, or it's a question about the state, the condition of the souls of individual persons. And Augustine's quite clear there can be some very holy, virtuous people uh, who, to all appearances might seem quite bad or complicit in earthly injustice, and vice versa. There can be some very bad, vicious people operating in the highest levels of the church. So the two cities do not map on to political and spiritual authority for Augustine. You can't emphasize that enough. But in our readings today, you begin to see how that distinction, that subtlety falls apart, that our thinkers begin to coordinate to parallel the two cities with these institutions. And of course, by the late medieval period, the conflict of church and state becomes primarily an institutional turf war, a jurisdictional turf war. And a lot of those fundamental moral questions about what is these two cities, who are in them, who is in them, those all disappear. Uh, so this, of course, ran a little long, but I'm grateful for your patience. And I invite any questions, any comments about these three wonderful thinkers, and I hope you enjoyed them as much as I did. So take care and hope to talk to you all soon.